Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to our second day of our conference. In this session, Confronting World War II in Literature, our distinguished panel will discuss the ways in which prominent poets and writers confronted the war of extermination in their literary work. The poets and writers' personal experiences were transmuted, into the works of artistic genius that inspired generations of readers in America, Israel, and the Soviet Union. Please welcome Anna Shternshis of the University of Toronto, who will serve as a moderator and introduce today's panel. Thank you, Anna.
Hi, thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be moderating and introducing our distinguished panel. So our first speaker today is Professor David Fishman, who is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he teaches courses on modern Jewish history. Dr. Fishman is an author of numerous books, most recently, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, which came out in 2017, was a winner of the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category, and has been translated into 8 languages. He's an author of other monographs, but I will not take the time to read them so that we have a chance to hear Professor Fishman's paper. Professor Fishman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anya. Good morning, everybody. And I want to join the choir of really thanking the organizers of this remarkable conference, the Blavatnik Foundation, Genesis Philanthropy, and it's an honor and pleasure to participate. I'm going to draw attention to a Yiddish novel about Jewish Red Army veterans and their personal lives. They're written by the Yiddish author Chaim Grade. It may be the only Yiddish novel on Jewish Red Army veterans, about their lives right after the war. Certainly it's the only, I think, Yiddish novel on Jewish Red Army soldiers and veterans written outside the Soviet Union. To get me started, I'm going to quickly refer to Chaim Grade more generally and his other works, and then focus on this specific novel. Now comes the hard part, seeing if I can get the PowerPoint to work. I think it will. Okay, Chaim Grade, just briefly to refresh memories of many who you know. Born in Vilna in 1910, learned in yeshivas and with the revered rabbi, the Chazon Ish. He left the world of orthodoxy. He joined the literary group Jung Vilna, published his first book of poems in 1936. He fled Vilna on foot in the very first days of the German invasion. He was a refugee in Central Asia. His wife and his mother perished in the Vilna ghetto. He returned to Vilna in 1945, eventually left for Poland. From there, eventually reached the United States in 1948. He died in New York in 1982. In other words, he spent the last 35 years of his life in the United States. Before I get to the specific novel, I will say something about Grade's reaction to the war and to the Holocaust. It's an impact on his literary career writ large. Of course, the biggest shift is from poetry to prose. After the war, he's mainly a prose writer. And in that prose, quite remarkably, all of his prose is set in pre-war Vilna and pre-war Lithuanian. He attempts to do the impossible, which is to reconstruct or recreate his destroyed community in literature, through the imagination, to undo the Holocaust through his imagination. His characters were mainly rabbis or traditional poor Jews. Secular Jews are on the margins of these books of prose. what's quite remarkable is the narrator in them speaks as if it's July 1939. In other words, as if there's no awareness that a war is imminent, that the Holocaust will or has happened. There's never a fast forward to the ghetto or a flash forward. We the readers, have some vague notion, we should, that these characters, the vast majority of characters, will perish, but the narrator doesn't seem to give any hint that these characters will perish. And of course, there's a lot of topographic and ethnographic vividness and detail. I just will point out this was his life's literary mission. Grade never wrote a story set in the United States, or a novel, or even a chapter that was set in the United States. All 35 years when he wrote prose in the United States, the prose is set in pre-war Vilna. Now, the novel I will talk about is a real exception in his corpus of writing, and it's never appeared in book form, and it's never appeared in English translation. It's called Freuen von Ghetto. It was serialized in the newspaper Tag Morgen Journal in 1961. Later, it was revised and expanded for a novel, also unfinished novel, called Von unter der Erde, From Under the Earth, which ran in the Vorwärts from 1979 to 1982. But I'm actually going to focus on the first version, Freuen von Ghetto, Women of the Ghetto, which I think is actually stronger than the later version. I would even rename this novel, if you wanted to capture what it's about, Freuen von Ghetto und Männer von Front. That is, Women of the Ghetto and the Men from the Front. Get back to the PowerPoint. Just a second. There you are. You can see an installment of it. What it is about mainly is about men returning from the front to Vilna. These are Vilna men who escaped, either were evacuated before the war broke out, or escaped during the first days of the war. They join the Red Army. Their wives they're separated from their wives, who go through the whole experience of the ghetto. And it is, broadly speaking, a novel about the experiential divide between being in the army and being in the ghetto, and the great gender divide between men who were in the army and women who were in the ghetto. Now, it's important to mention, I think for this conference especially, it's a special subset of Jewish fighters in the Red Army. These are the fighters of the 16th Lithuanian Division, who I don't think have got mentioned in this conference. It was a division of the Red Army of former Lithuanian citizens, but it had an inordinately high proportion of Jews. Usually you see 30% of the soldiers in the 16th Lithuanian Division were Jewish. There were about 15,000 soldiers total, so 30% is a commonly cited number, though historian Dov Levine believes that at the peak, 50% of the soldiers were Jewish. So there were units in the Lithuanian division that were overwhelmingly or entirely Jewish, like this photo here. There were units where the language of military commands was Yiddish, where orders were given in Yiddish, where songs sung around the campfire were Jewish orders. In fact, quite strikingly, the battle cry of Jewish fighters in the Lithuanian division was not Za Rodinu, za Stalina, for the motherland, for Stalin, but rather Far unsere tates und mames, for our fathers and mothers, meaning for our murdered fathers and mothers. Now, Grade's novel is not about the battles in Oryol or Belarus or Lithuania. It's about how they return and try to establish a normal life. And that proves to be very difficult and, in fact, impossible. It means getting married or reuniting with your pre-war wife after 3-4 years of separations. And the boundaries are ones of different senses of guilt, of pain, misunderstanding, alienation between men and women. One of the heroes is a military physician whose wife perished in the ghetto. When he comes back, he marries an old maid, someone who'd never been with a man. And he only marries her for one reason, because she lived in the same address that his wife did in the ghetto. He wants to remember his murdered wife through his second wife. She agrees to marry him and regrets it almost immediately. The marriage has no glue. He pleads with her to stay married. He says, we aren't youngsters. I'm 50, you're 40. We don't need a passionate romance. Let's just have a marriage of the minor joys of everyday life. Eating breakfast together, seeing each other in the evening and sharing news, inviting guests, buying things for the household. Why should we be alone when we can be together? And she replies, you can't start life together with that stage. A couple that went through stages of passion, storms, conflicts, they can settle down to a life of minor everyday joys. But when you start a marriage that way, it's a lie. There's another veteran in this novel who goes the opposite way. His wife and daughter have also been murdered, and he decides the only woman he can have is someone who's totally unlike his wife. He finds a Soviet girl, a Jewish girl who grew up in Kiev, whose Yiddish is halting and broken, who knows very little about Jewish culture and tradition, with light hair, young, and he says, I can marry a girl like that. So the novel is sort of all driven by these relationships and marriages. One wife complains to her husband, you've changed. The war changed you. Your Russian is better, but it's full of curse words. You were gentle and refined before the war. Now you smoke endlessly this hand-rolled tobacco, and you hold your body in an undignified way. And he replies back to, well, you've also changed. You were a happy girl before the war. Now you're constantly melancholy and withdrawn. This woman has a big secret, which is they had a son. The son was with her in the ghetto. When the ghetto was liquidated and there was a separation, left and right, left to your death in Ponari and right to labor camps, she let go of her son's hand. The son went to the left, she went to the right. She tells everybody a lie that a German grabbed her son and tore him away from her, but that's the lie. She knows the truth. She dropped her son's hand to go to the right. She can't tell her husband that secret. He wants to start a new life. He wants to have a baby. She can't have a baby. So what the novel is really about is about the enduring different pains everybody brings when you try to reestablish a life after World War II and the those who return to the front. There are some, I'm about to conclude, there are some moments of public life or issues that cut across the purely personal. The most poignant is one of these veterans trying to regain his apartment from before the war, the address where he lived before the war with his first wife and child. He goes there in uniform, barges in, demands to get his apartment back, finds there a Lithuanian with his family, starts cursing at him. I was at the front while you were either in the rear or under German occupation. And I have the military rank of a major. And the Lithuanian shoots back at him. I've been in the Lithuanian Communist Party for 20 years. I work for the Sovnarkom, for the Council of Ministers. My rank is much higher than yours. And anyway, Poles lived here before I came to this apartment. I was given this apartment in 1944. I know nothing about you. Get away from here. And he calls the police, and the police take him away, and he leaves in disgrace. So the novel ends with the disillusionment of both the veterans and the women from the ghetto that they can rebuild any kind of personal life or Jewish life in post-war Soviet Vilnius. Especially the proximity of the ghetto is what haunts them and doesn't leave them alone. And also Jewish life comes in because it's the harassment of Jewish cultural institutions that they notice, especially the Jewish orphanage that existed in post-war Vilnius. It can't get supplies, furniture, food for the kids, and it's under threat of closure. And it symbolizes if the orphans can't be taken care of, then there is no Jewish future in Vilnius. So one by one, at different stages, they leave, and by repatriating to Poland, as Vilna Jews, they can repatriate to Poland. They take with them stray documents of the pre-war YIVO, a kind of memento for them of pre-war Vilna, but they have made their decision. In other words, these Red Army veterans, people who fought in the ranks of the Red Army, give up on the Soviet Union, and they want to create a new life elsewhere. So I think this touches on many themes that we've sort of encountered in the conference so far, and it's a sort of buried treasure that really deserves the attention and deserves to be read and translated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fishman. Really rich paper, and I'm restraining myself from asking questions. Also, hoping I'm not echoing too much. So I encourage our listeners, our audience, to think of questions and put them in Q&A. The earlier you put in your question, the bigger chances that you will actually get to ask it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kanapalin Galai, who's an assistant professor in the literature department at Tel Aviv University, where she also directs the Goldreich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature and Culture. Her work focuses on intersection between Holocaust and Yiddish studies, and her most recent book is called Ecologies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, and it came out with the Yale University Press in 2018. Hannah, take it away, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such a great paper. David, thank you for all these wonderful attendees. And looking at the attendees, this is like a Pesach family reunion. I don't know what. This is a wonderful group of people I have here. So I would love it if, Aaron, if you could put my slides up, please. Aaron, thank you. Okay, good. And you can go ahead to the first slide. So I'm going to be speaking. About representations of Red Army soldiers, of at least one Jewish Red Army soldier, but more importantly, I'm also going to be speaking about Red Army soldiers, Jewish Red Army soldiers, as readers and as conversants, as partners in dialogue with the poet Avrom Sutzkever. So I want to start on April 13th, 1944, the day in which a Red Army soldier named Ilya Gurevich wrote a letter to the esteemed poet Avrom Sutzkever, Yiddish poet from Vilna. We've heard about Vilna already, in which he wrote, "I've been in the Red Army 3 years. I volunteered for the Red Army on the 29th of June, 1941 in Vitebsk. I took part in battles in Estonia, and I was wounded on the 21st of July in Tartu. I'm happy that I've taken part in taking arms in the battle against the lowliest of humanity. But how can one be happy after the entire devastation of a people, of a mother, a child, a brother, a sister?" I think that this is a tension that you'll find in a lot of Jewish Red Army writings, that on the one hand, they're participating in the rhetoric of victory and pride, and on the other hand, trying to find a place to mourn and to discuss that thing that would eventually be called the Holocaust. Next slide, please. And then he goes on, he shares more about his story, which is, of course, still developing in real time as he writes, this soldier Ilya Gurevich. And then he concludes with something that should strike us as curious. He says, "If it's not too much trouble for you, please write a couple of words and send me your poem, Kol Nidre. I send you my best wishes and thanks in advance." Now, I hope that we'll not immediately block off our instincts of today. Try to imagine, for instance, I don't know, a soldier in any contemporary army writing to Pearl Glick, the poet laureate of 2 years ago, the Nobel poet laureate, asking, I have to get your poem. I'm in the army and I have to get your poem. Why does a Red Army soldier feel that it's urgent for him to read this poem? And he was not the only one. This poem, he eventually, there's a letter in which Gurevich does get a copy of the poem. He copies this poem by hand, and it circulates like this informally among different Jewish Red Army soldiers, some of them in the 16th Division, mentioned earlier, and as well as by other Jewish refugees, that is, those who were not fighting but were in the East. So my lecture is about the conversation that took place between Sutzkever, as a poet, and his admirers in the unoccupied Soviet Union towards the end of World War II. And I want to use this textual exchange to investigate the various ways that meaning is drawn from firsthand experience in that process that we often call testimony. And I'd like to suggest that Sutzkever's particular way of witnessing in poetry, in the press, and in his public experiences is what we could call a dialogical or reversible form of testimony. As Ilya Gurevich's letter suggests, something about Sutzkever's public narrative act called out for reciprocation, inviting Soviet Jews, including soldiers, to narrate their war stories in response to his, or simply to reassert their human presence through the act of writing to him. Sutzkever may have seemed especially approachable to the Jewish public in the unoccupied Soviet Union thanks to his biographical profile as a victim turned hero and as a Vilner who gained acceptance in Moscow circles. But I contend the poet also highlighted and enabled this dialogic process in the particular way that he wrote. I believe that Sutzkever's escape story, at least the version that he tells, is well known to some people attending this panel. He was situated in a partisan encampment in the Naroch forest. He sent the handwritten manuscript of the epic poem Pollin-Galay with the partisan Shiki Gertman across the Eastern Front in December of 1943. The poem ended up in powerful hands. Following some kind of a collaboration between Ilya Ehrenburg, Yusas Paletskis, the president of the Lithuanian SSR in exile, Peretz Markish, and Shlomo Mikhails, planes were sent to Sutzkever's rescue, and in March of 1944, he and his wife Frede were airlifted into Moscow and greeted by hundreds of letters by impassioned readers. Now, it might be tempting to simplify, to reduce this story, and to think that Sutzkever received all of this excitement because he was the first to bring information of the Jewish catastrophe to the unoccupied Soviet Union. However, this is not true, at least not on a factual, empirical level. At least, for instance, regarding his hometown of Vilna, Einikite, the Yiddish newspaper at the time, had already reported on the destruction of Vilna on October 14th of 1943, about 1 month after the ghetto's final liquidation. And there were earlier less explicitly Jewish reports that had appeared in Izvestia and in Vechernaya Moskva. So if Sutzkever was not the first bearer of horrific news, perhaps he was the first one to tell of this news in a personal voice. No, again, next slide, please. Thank you. There were various publications in the Soviet Union that had already come out in which personal stories of the Jews under Nazi occupation had already been printed. Among them, we can, there's Blut ruft zu Nikome, Blood Calls Out for Revenge from 1941, that's early. And then prominently 1944, Murder von Felker by Ilya Ehrenburg, which was, of course, also published as Murderers of People, which was also published as Narodoubitsi in Russian. And there's also a publication by Vasily Grossman, Travinsky Ad. So this also exists. So it's not enough to say that Sutzkever brought the first personal story of what would later be called the Holocaust. Instead, I argue that we have to actually look in and investigate the type of testimony that had already existed in the unoccupied Soviet Union and think about how that was different from the type of testimony that Sutzkever created in his poetry and in his various public appearances. To speak in very broad terms, the testimony like Murder von Felker that was already out there circulating somewhere in the unoccupied Soviet Union, they depicted the Jewish victim in a very particular light, the voice of the Jewish victim, as a voice that was very true and valuable, but also naive. And one had to actually translate that in order to make meaning of it. In Narodovici and in Murder von Felker by Ehrenburg, he prints the stories as the testimonies as they sound in a very simple Yiddish or in simple Russian in the other version. But he's the one that brings them meaning with an introduction, explains why this is important. So he is the prophetic witness with values and with a message to share, and the simple Jews from Poland, Lithuania are just there to get the facts on the ground of what happened to them. This is not the case with Sutzkever's writing. Next slide, please. So even before the poem Kol Nidre was printed in Zum Sieg, the collection Zum Sieg, which means Towards Victory, in August of 1944, a very interesting collection for other reasons as well, the piece had already been read aloud in public. So soldiers who received a copy of this poem had read it aloud on their stump to other soldiers. It had been requested, it had been circulated informally, and even it's rumored that it had been translated into Russian. In his high-profile article, Triumph of a Man, Ilya, which appeared in Pravda, Ilya Ehrenburg drew public attention to Kol Nidre. So consider this also. I don't remember if it was on the front page or the second page, but on Pravda, there's a summary of a Yiddish epic poem with the phrase Kol Nidre in Russian transliteration. So there was something that people were fascinated and drawn to about this poem. So let me tell you what happens in this poem, okay? So you can't reduce epic poetry to a plot, but the plot also happens to be very, very captivating. So it's Yom Kippur of 1942. And an old man, Sutzkever, some version of Sutzkever appears. He's in the great synagogue in Yom Kippur, 1942, when he hears an old man crying out, and he says, "What's your story?" The old man tells him the story. All of his children, all 5 of his sons, have already been killed in the ghetto or before the ghetto, except one about whom he does not know anything. He doesn't know any about his whereabouts. That's because that son had run away from home in Vilna, 20 years earlier to fight off Petrulia's army in Ukraine. And the old man reflects on how much his dying wish is to see this wayward son. And just as he's saying this, an injured Red Army soldier is pushed into the prison yard, and the old man recognizes instantly that this happens to be his son, this soldier. And Sutzkever, by the way, you see this long footnote at the bottom of the page that I'm sharing with you. There's a footnote saying where Sutzkever explains that this is a true story, whether or not it was or not, but okay, he's relaying this incredible story. So the Red Army soldier, the injured Red Army soldier, turns out to be his son. And just then a German soldier comes in, a Nazi comes in, he requires all the Jews present to bow down to him, to kneel on their knees. The Red Army soldier / the wayward son refuses to kneel down. The Nazi grabs him. He's about to torture this wayward son. And just at that moment, the old man kills his own son with his own hand in order to prevent him from being tortured. So this is the plot. Obviously would have appeal to Soviet Jewish readers at the time. It overlays the apocryphal story of Hannah, who encouraged her 7 sons to sacrifice their lives rather than recant Jewish alliance, onto a contemporary wartime fantasy of family reunion and reconciliation. As we heard from the previous talk, reconciliation and reunion was an important theme of the literature. But going beyond the plot, there's also something in the form that I think is incredibly powerful and compelling about this poem, and was compelling at the time. Next slide, please. So there's a metaphor that Sutzkever uses here to describe the way that he tries to convey testimony. So you'll see that in I'll just skip to the second quote. Die Wörter haben noch wie Jar geatemt in mein Leib. These words, like embers, still inside me, breathing. That is to say, he tries to incorporate. He doesn't just relay the old man's story. He actually tries to imbibe this story, to take the testimony of these so-called simple Lithuanian Polish Jews and incorporate them into his poetic voice and turn them into something beautiful, to make them the prophets, the bearers of prophetic testimony, as opposed to the way that Ehrenburg split the literary voice between the naive teller of facts and the prophetic bearer of a message. Next slide, please. This is especially apparent in the climatic scene when the old man starts to talk to this Red Army soldier. He wants to see if this is actually his son. Okay, so the old man is I. He says to me, he sees this guy, this injured soldier, thinks it's his son. He says, "Ihr seid a Vilner, are you a Vilner?" And here's the clincher. Here's the most important word in the poem. The son answers, "Yeah," which is, as anyone who knows Vilner Yiddish or Litvak Yiddish, that's a surefire sign of dialect, meaning colloquial voice. At the very center of the poem, Sutzkever uplifts colloquial Yiddish to make that the bearer of poetic beauty and of a prophetic message. So Sutzkever, as opposed to Ehrenburg and the other Soviet Jewish leaders who conveyed testimony in the Soviet Union, he actually incorporated the sound of Yiddish from the occupied territories into his poetry and gave dignity to the witness's voice. Next slide, please. So when this was published, it's as if Sutzkever, in dignifying this poetic, this voice of the so-called simple, old-fashioned Lithuanian Polish Jew, the Yiddish speaker, not the updated Russian-speaking Soviet Jew, when he did that, it was as if he sent out a message to all of the Jews from the West, so-called West, from Poland, Lithuania. It's as if he sent out a message to them: "I'm listening. I'm summoning for you. Tell me your story." I believe that that's how they heard his voice, his poetic voice and his public voice, and they did indeed respond in kind. And out of the hundreds of letters on which I'm basing my observations, I just want to share a few of them with you here. How did people, these readers, relate to Sutzkever? This one is by Arke Eisen. This is a long narrative letter. There's very little pragmatic request in this letter. It's a story. It's a life story. He writes, "This letter is being written to you by a friend from your childhood, someone that was raised on the same street as you. We played together in the courtyard at Tobias's. In short, a Schnippishker, a baker, and on top of that, a blonde by the name of Arke Noach, the shoemaker's son, who lived across from the pump right there where there was a store and a bakery. My family name is Eisen." So in his cadence and in his incorporation of local geographic detail, Arke Eisen sounds almost like Yome Kagan, the son character from Sutzkever's poem called Nidre, who never lost his local dialect and still speaks about his hoif, his heif, as his ID card. Arke Eisen writes of actually having known Sutzkever. Next slide, please. But what is interesting is that there are also many refugees, soldiers who write to him in the same personal mode without any type of acquaintance. I love this letter personally because on a visual letter, it's two different women, one named Esther Edelman and one is her friend whose name is illegible on the letter. But I think that as a visual object, the passion with which they wrote to him is palpable. And you can see up in the top left corner, that's the list of names that they gave him, which has also become almost a ritual, as if just pronouncing these names, writing them on this tiny scrap of paper was a reminder that these people actually existed and that they mattered. And that Sutzkever was the one that they wanted to know, or he was the one that they thought would listen to him. Even these brief urgent messages constitute an autobiographical act, a pronouncement of one's presence and significance, testimony in the deepest sense of the term. To conclude,
sorry. Oh, good. You have 1 minute.
Sutzkever used his wartime writing not only to witness events, but to witness witnessing. And he incorporated the stories of other people into his ongoing project of telling his own. He made this very method of incorporation to a focal point, poetically exploring how people testify with and through one another, And that was a message that resonated with refugees and Red Army soldiers. Thank you.
You and I listened to you with such interest that I forgot to tell you about the time. So I apologize. But, so thank you so much. As usual, please think of the questions to our audience. And our next speaker is Professor Mikhail Krutikov, who holds the position of Preston Tisch Professor of Slavic and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He's an author of many books. I'm only going to tell you the latest one, Der Nister's Soviet Years, Yiddish Writer as Witness to the People, which came out of Indiana University Press in 2019. His current project explores representations of urban space in Jewish literature and the short revival of Soviet Yiddish culture between 1943 and 48. Professor Khrutikov, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just want to join previous speakers in thanking the organizers of this conference. And it's such a pleasure to be on this panel with my old friends. And in my paper, I think I will actually refer to the same motif that David Fishman so elaborately explained on Chaim Grade. And this is something that I think Harriet Moore described as fictions of return. It's an old motif in Yiddish literature when a character comes back to the place that he or she left a while ago, often to find this place completely devastated. I think the best example is Mendel's novel, The Windschfinger, but I'm not going into this history. But what I'm going to try to do in this short time is to look very quickly at two stories by two Soviet Yiddish writers that were published right after the war by their MS Verlag. And they both refer to this motif, and they both try to incorporate it into the Soviet narrative, but also to add some kind of a Jewish twist to it. And I think it would be a very interesting contrast and compare exercise with Chaim Grade's novel. So I will start with the short story by Yechiel Falikman, who was probably the major Soviet writer about the war. He wrote a number of novels. He was himself a major in the Soviet army. And he published a short collection of stories right after the war in 1947, I believe. And I take one story from this collection. It's called Einerenshtetl. And the narrator is a Soviet officer, like Falikman himself, whose unit stays for a short rest in the recently liberated shtetl. He finds himself in a courtyard trying to make sense of what he sees around. And I quote in my clumsy English translation, but I hope it conveys the message. I'm sitting in someone's abandoned courtyard, and my mind, tired and excited at the same time, is seeking an answer to questions which nobody can answer. I want to imagine the life that used to be here and has vanished, and what will come after I march away from here with my military unit. The shtetl is completely dead. The houses of clay and brick are half ruined and overgrown with weeds. So it's been destroyed for a while. Humidity destroys materials, and nature takes over. By contrast to the completely dead and ruined Jewish center of the shtetl, outskirts already show some signs of returning life as peasants come back to their homes from the villages, non-Jewish Ukrainian peasants. And then the narrator discovers a sole Jewish survivor, a tinsmith named Mikhail Krutikov, who has, as he writes it, woken up to life, and he began rebuilding a ruined house, starting from its basement. And there is something in Melech's movements, I quote, that comes not from a living creature, was kommt nicht von kein lebendigen Menschen. The sound of his hitting with hammer sends, quote, a signal to the dead that one person has remained alive, end of quote. Melech appears to the narrator as a ghost figure between life and death, someone who has returned from the world of the dead, but is not yet quite at home among the living. He is eager to share his experience, but he has no words to begin with. He is like a sick man who is just recovering from a heavy illness. That's the way he is described. He looks at the tools of his trade and ponders. I quote, I've got a hammer, a bar, and a pair of scissors. What else does a tinsmith need? Yes, that's a question. And then he tries to answer his question. A tinsmith would also need his wife and his children. Of course, he doesn't have them anymore. They're killed. Melech's first client is a Ukrainian woman who has been hiding him for 2 weeks and for whom he now has to repair a bucket. So presumably he was taken by the Germans just before the liberation to be killed. Then he ran away and he was hidden by that Ukrainian woman. And the work helps him regain his ability to speak, and he tells the story of his escape. And he, as he was driven to the execution by the Germans, he was carrying his heavy scissors, with which he managed to kill a German soldier, but he was the only one who was able to survive. Now, the sound of Melech's hammer echoes the beating of his heart, which has a lot to tell, but the story cannot be expressed in words. So there is this inability of telling the story, a very important theme in this novella. This is the story of the strength of man who is left absolutely lonely but still alive. At this point, the direction of the narrative turns around. A story about the end of the shtetl becomes a story about a new beginning. Falikman writes, I quote, and I think that though Melech is the only one here, he is not the last one. He, Melech, is the first one. There was already hundreds of years ago on this land another first one like him. Perhaps he also came with a pair of scissors and a hammer, and some peasant woman, Oniska or Yavdocha, also needed a bucket to be mended, and he stayed there to do the piece of work. So history kind of repeats itself in cyclical fashion. Once upon a time, hundreds of years ago, a Jew was passing by this place with his hammer and scissors and stopped to fix something to bucket. So it's a sort of a proletarian narrative of very familiar motif of Pollin, of a Jewish history, how Jews came to Eastern Europe. Now, of course, they came as workers to help local people do something useful for them. And at the same time, this Jewish version merges with, of course, socialist realist optimism that was expected and demanded from Yiddish writers, not only from Yiddish writers. It also presents productive labor as a kind of communal therapy. It's through labor that Jews will be sort of rehabilitated. What is also interesting about the story, there is another twist where Melech points to a broken brichka, which once belonged to someone called Noach the Balagola. This Noach was lucky to escape with his daughters, but Melech is certain that he would come back one day together with his daughters and grandchildren. Noach vezichumkem. Of course, this is can be read as a reference to the biblical story of Noach in an interesting way, because it's also quite ironic, because here Noach ran away with his daughters from the flood, and hopefully at some point he will come back. So we have to wait and see. Lomer hof and hope. Lomer hoffen und warten. That's the end of the story. So this biblical reference, I think, enhances the story by adding a touch of midrash. This sort of Soviet variety. Of course, it would be understandable to people who catch this reference with some knowledge of the Bible, Jews and non-Jews alike. Just to bring another example of a kind of similar use of biblical references, I'll take us to the story titled Arise Ahim by another very Soviet Yiddish writer, Yosef Rabin, who was also fighting on the front, but he was sent to the front from a labor camp. He was arrested in 1937 and he was released in 1943 and sent fighting.
Mr. Sorry to interrupt, you have 1 minute.
Okay, here we have another twist with the story, and I'll just tell you the twist of it, because all characters have biblical names, but in the Soviet edition, the biblical names, in the early edition, the biblical names were changed. Reuben was changed to Velvel, and then in the later Russian translation, all the names were restored. In other words, what I was trying to say was that we have, but I think I'm just speaking for 10 minutes now. I mean,
Down 10:22, and now it's, oh, sorry, never mind. Okay, keep talking. Keep talking.
All right, that's good. So, Arise Ahem. Here we have two demobilized Russian Red Army soldiers who returned to their hometown in western Belarus. Probably it was Grodno, which Rabin's native city. And he hopes to find a bride here, so a motif very similar to Gradas, among the 13 Jews who remain alive. On the train, he meets another Jewish soldier, and together they come to the city. They thought, as he said, they'll come there as someone who was invited to a wedding but found himself at the funeral. They discover that the cemetery is left with no tombstones, and the eternal rest have been uprooted, and even your dead ones are no longer alive. I think it's a very powerful statement here. On the street, they meet an elderly Jew who, with a shadow of the German hell on his face, that's the quote. The man asked him took them to the 13 Jewish survivors who believe that they are the only Jews left in the entire world. One of them is a young woman with whom the narrator companion falls in love and wants to start a new life by building a house in their old hometown. Annoyed by this wild fantasy, the narrator feels jealous and angry and wants to leave immediately. As he explains to his friend, he doesn't want to find himself in a position of his friend's father, who was hopelessly in love with his narrator's mother. So it's this kind of another version of that complex situation of trying to start a new family after the Holocaust. But then, of course, the ending is different because he says, I will like our fathers. We are the Red Army soldiers. We did not leave. They did not leave. They suffered. Our life is in our hands. The ruined town is awaiting us. And the story ends happily. I stayed and then congratulated him. So everything ends well. What is interesting here, as I said, try to say, are the names. So the narrator is called Shimon, his friend is called Reuven. Their fathers were named Yankov and Israel. The names of their beloved were Leah and Rochel. 13, of course, the number of survivors is, of course, the number of the tribes of Israel. So it's an allegory of the biblical story. And what is interesting is that in the first Soviet edition, the names were changed. Shimon was replaced with Velv, and Leah was replaced with Blume. And then in the Russian edition, the names were restored. I could surmise that probably the Soviet censor actually caught this reference and decided to play it safe and not to make. So it shows how sophisticated actually Soviet censorship was, although in one place he left actually Shimon. So probably we can definitely say that that was Rabin's intention. Again, something that was aimed at a reader who could catch all these references. Also interesting that Shimon and Reuven are characters in the Talmud, like A and B, who represent the typical case studies. So again, this is represented as a more general allegory of the Jewish return. So the stories, and I'm going to conclude, the stories depict the first encounter between the Soviet protagonist and the locals. The interaction goes in two directions. The protagonist learns firsthand about the catastrophe that destroyed his native town and affected his family and neighbors. The locals receive assistance and encouragement for return to a normal life through reintegration into the Soviet society through productive labor by rebuilding the ruins, which will enable them to start a new family. Despite the gruesome details of the mass murder and destruction, the general tenor of the stories is optimistic. They end on a hopeful note that Jews would eventually return to their hometowns and start a new life together with their non-Jewish neighbors. The problem of memory and trauma remains in the background and is dealt with metaphorically using symbolic imagery derived from the Jewish religious tradition and folklore. And there are other examples that is possible to bring. So I think this is more of a trend in the Soviet Yiddish literature, written right after, between 1944 and 1948. Thank you.
And again, sorry for the interruption. I had problem with math ever since, this homeschooling kids. I mean, literally, it's very bad for my addition and the subtraction, the skills. But thank you so much for this very rich paper. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions. And now our last, but definitely not the least presenter, Professor Gennady Estraikh, who holds a position of professor at this Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at NYU. His interests lie in the history of Soviet Jews, Jewish intellectual history, and Yiddish literature. And his latest book is called Transatlantic Russian Jewishness, just came out in 2020. Okay, so as I'm not reading all the books, Gennady, to give you a chance to actually give your paper. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I will also invest this, if you we have just very limited amount of time, but still, thank you very much for inviting me and for this excellent panel as well. Yeah, especially as I continue essentially what Professor Khrutikov started. I'll focus also on a Soviet writer who's the writers Hil Falikman and Joseph Rabin are not so well known, yes, outside the very narrow circle of those who deals with Soviet Yiddish literature. And my character is Shmuel Gardon. It is his photo. He was born in 1909 and died in 1989. And almost his entire life he lived in Moscow. And from the very beginning, almost, his main genre was documentary prose, a kind of a hybrid of journalism and fiction. And maybe he was the best one of the best ones in Soviet Yiddish literature. He focused in his writings, in particular, on Crimean colonies, where Gordon lived and worked for over a year in 1931 and 1932, after graduating from the Yiddish department at the Moscow Pedagogical Institute, which was effectively the central training ground for Yiddish writers and literary scholars in the Soviet Union. His literary snapshots made up his first book, Between the Azov and Black Seas. The book came out in 1934, when Crimea already had scores of Jewish collective farms. It also had a Jewish national district established in 1931. In 1935, one more Jewish district emerged in the territorial structure of Crimea. Surprisingly, and still inexplicably, at least for me, this happened a year after the establishment of the Jewish Autonomous Region with Birobidzhan as its administrative center. During World War II, Gordon was associated with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. In 1942, his story, Eli Yehudin, came out in the collection Zum Sieg, edited by Peretz Markish and already mentioned in presentation by Hannah. The protagonist of the story, Ilya Yehudin, a collective farm chairman in Crimea. The Israeli historian Yehoshua Kilbar used Gordon's 1944 story to illustrate how the wartime national awakening among Soviet Jews had found reflection in Yiddish literature of that time. He was impressed that in Gordon's description of the evacuation of Crimean colonists, some of them were in holiday attire, carrying with great care cases containing scrolls of the law, which David Berg abandoned to the cursed Hamans. It's a quote. Indeed, the story is full of references to Jewish tradition. The evacuation takes place in the fall of 1941, but on the last days spent in the colony, elderly Jews untimely follow the rituals of Tisha B'Av. Elderly colonists fulfill customs such as sitting on the floor and visiting cemeteries. Eli's father tells his son that instead of taking a handful of holy earth, as their legendary forefathers had done on leaving Jerusalem, he took grains from the harvest as a symbol of their interrupted happiness and of their eventual return to Crimea. After reaching the port city of Kerch at the eastern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, the colonists continued their dangerous journey by sea, and the description of their crossing of the Kerch Strait, connecting the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, carries biblical allusions to Noah's Ark. This can be construed as evidence that Jewish tradition continued to be observed in Crimean colonies, and that the religious and political activist Solomon Zevin, rabbi in the Belarusian town of Novozhivkov, was wrong when in 1926 he wrote to the leadership of the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, I quote, "The heart of all Jews bleeds at the sight of the new Crimean colonies, which lack all Jewish spirit and coloring and have no kosher meat, no ritual bath, teaches for their children, nor any of the religious necessities that these settlers have been accustomed to all their lives." Indeed, Edwin Embry, president of Julius Rosenwald Foundation, which played an important role in sponsoring Jewish colonization in Crimea, didn't see any synagogues in the Crimean Jewish villages which he visited in 1935. At the same time, in many of the communities, he observed the following arrangement, quote, "There is a room where the sacred scrolls are kept and where religious services are held, attended chiefly by the older people." Still, we don't know to what degree Gordon's description reflected the reality of the events, or was only or mainly a product of his literary imagination tuned to reflecting the state's milder attitude to religious observance. When the collection Zum Sieg, Towards Victory, came out, Moscow Choral Synagogue was finally allowed to get a new chief rabbi, Shlomo Schlifer, who became a member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The previous rabbi was executed in 1938. Strikingly, Gordon ignored the fact, certainly known to him, that by the time of the war's outbreak, there was no such things anymore as Jewish national districts. In his story, however, the colonists appear as residents of such territorial units. Gordon emphasized an organized character of the evacuation of Jewish collective farmers. It was important to show the leading role of the state and party organs in saving the Jewish population. In 1942, David Berg published an article making the false propaganda claim that the Soviet government had organized a timely evacuation of 80% of the Jews from the occupied territories. It's another question how Holocaust deniers use this article. I don't have time to talk about this. In fact, there was no preferential evacuation of the Jewish population in general and from Crimea in particular. However, Jews tended to realize the danger and made up a third of all those Crimean residents who succeeded in leaving the peninsula before its occupation by the Germans. In all, more than a half of the 65,000 Jewish residents left the peninsula as evacuees or draftees. Paradoxically, it was the relatively well-organized evacuation of livestock belonging to collective farms that had saved lives of thousands of colonists who accompanied the herds. Of the 18,000 Jews living in Crimean rural areas, a third stayed put and were mostly murdered during their occupation. Both during and after the war, the smear Jews fought in Tashkent gained currency in various quarters of society. As a reaction, many Jews, including writers, had developed a counter-Tashkent syndrome, at least I call it like this, and didn't miss a chance to emphasize the reality of Jewish participation in the war. In Gordon's story, too, only elderly collective farms, women and children are moving to the rear of the country, whereas younger people are ready to fight. One colonist says, a Jew is not Jewish at all if he is able to fight, but wants someone else to do this instead of him. Crimea appeared again in Gordon journalism of the second half of the 1940s. Some of his observations were reprinted abroad, including I found a Yiddish newspaper in Cuba. When Gordon came to Crimea in the 1940s, Yiddish was widely spoken in the collective farms. It seemed that up to 60% of all the colonists who evacuated in 1941 decided to return to the Crimean settlements between 1944 and 1946. Moreover, the returnees assumed a disproportionately high number of leadership positions. Thus, former colonists served as chairs in 15% of the collective farms in the northern area of Crimea between 1945 and 1953. Crimea also played a role in Shmuel Gardon's own life in that decade. Among the charges against the writers and journalists associated with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, liquidated in 1948 as part of the Stalinist regime's assault on the remaining Jewish organizations, was a fabrication of a plot allegedly aimed at establishing in Crimea a Jewish republic with only one purpose, namely to provide a springboard for imperialist aggression. As an episode in that paranoid tale, Gordon had been dispatched to Crimea not simply to write about the return of surviving colonists, but to investigate the conditions for rebuilding a Jewish republic. In 1949, the trip and other false accusations led to him being sentenced to 15 years of incarceration in the Gulag. Stalin's death shortened his sentence. In August 1955, Gordon returned to Moscow and rejoined the Yiddish literary circles, which regrouped later around the Moscow journal Sovetish Heimland, the only Soviet Yiddish literary outlet. By the end of the 1970s, Gordon once again visited Crimea. He witnessed a different picture there. Now the former colonists had few Jewish families among their dwellers. A former colonist told the writer that once their village lacked a hall and a touring Yiddish theater troupe had to perform in a barn, whereas now there was a spacious hall but no audience anymore. With the post-war decline of the colony communities, Jewish residents in rural areas of Crimea more often than not found themselves in an environment which had some similarities with the life of pre-Soviet yeshuvnik, or village Jew. Historically, they, for the most part, isolated individuals within non-Jewish villages formed a separate category of Eastern European Jews. Sholem Aleichem Stevie, the dairyman, for the Yeshuvnik. There was, however, an important difference between the old-time Yeshuvniks and the Crimean ones. The latter felt themselves being pioneering builders of the villages, whereas their non-Jewish neighbors were usually post-1945 migrants. In addition, many of those who had chosen to return and stay were valued and respected key workers. In the 1950s and the 1970s, judging by the censuses, the Crimean Jewish rural population was over 2,000 people. We can rather safely presume that the majority of them were veterans of pre-war colonization strive for their offspring. Yehudin, the most prominent among the veterans, was named the hero of socialist labor in 1966. He also had numerous other state decorations and titles and a seat at the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gennady, and thank you all presenters. What a rich panel, so much to think about, and this intersection between, I don't know, imagination, literature, and history is really incredible, and how it comes up and so differently and yet in such a powerful way in all your papers. So as our audience thinks of questions to ask, I'm going to start us off. I'm going to ask a question to each one of you, but I will just ask them all together, so then you can answer them later, and if more questions come, you can ignore them as well. So my first question is to David Fishman, and I have a similar question to Gennady Estraikh as well. So as I was listening to you, David, and listening to this fascinating retelling of Chaim Grade's novel, I mean, a few emotions came through, like how come we don't know about that work, and also there is something to be said for writing, documenting historical event through literature as this event unfolds, and also doing it from a distance, so the perspective is really valuable here. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on Chaim Grade in the context of all these Soviet Jewish writers who as we heard yesterday from Maxim Schreier and from some others, are documenting Holocaust the way they kind of use the imagination to fill the gaps. So, Grossman comes to Treblinka, sees the bones, writes his history. Sylvinsky sees the body, use imaginations, right? So Grade, like, what does he see? Does he see survivors? Does he kind of fill the gaps? Is he reading Sutzkever? Is he reading, listening to refugees? Where, how is he building that history? Because the examples you used in, I didn't read the novel, but what I heard from you say, these are examples kind of on the border of interpreting what people are saying, secrets, women protecting women kind of hiding the fact what happened to their kids. I haven't quite heard the story that he told, about the letting go of a child, but there are plenty of secrets of women choosing which child to save, it's a very controversial story. So I'm curious, what kind of history he's reconstructing from imagination, what is he thinking about in that context. And to Kanapalin Galai, tons of things to ask, but I just have to ask you something that you said at the beginning. This Ilya Gurevich writing to Sutzkever and asking, please send me that poem, which is such a powerful image, I think. Do you think Ilya Gurevich wrote to him because he read Ilya Ehrenburg and now he just has to read the original, And I'm curious, generally, what you think about Ehrenburg and Grossman and other Soviet Jewish journalists having access to all this Yiddish language, witnessing, and from Sutzkever and from others, and how that impacts their Russian language mainstream writing, so-called. And then my next question is to Mikhail Krutikov again. Sorry for the interruption of your paper in the middle, not good. But, I was thinking as I was listening to you about this image of half life, half dead, and I can't get it out of my head right now. And I'm thinking about this trope of dead coming back to life, so prominent in 1943, 44, 45, right? Like, there's a whole discussion about this. And I see it in folk poetry as well. So I often think about, why do dead come back? Are they coming back to tell the story? Are they coming back to revenge, to do justice? Are they coming back to, to repair something that living cannot do? So is this a common kind of post-violence, post-genocidal trope that we see everywhere? You know what I mean? Like, so I'm just curious if you could put this more in the context what other writers are thinking about and what those living dead, you know, coming back. And to Gennady, you know, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Shmuel Gardon because of you, you know, because I think you brought him to life, to our horizons. And I was thinking about, you know, him writing that history of Crimean Jews and that quote of David Bergelson. I don't know if I heard you correctly, that you said that Bergelson said that 80% of those Crimean Jews survive, Crimean Jewish colonies survive.
Not Crimean, but in general.
In general.
Occupied territories.
I don't know, like, I'm not a huge specialist with numbers, but that seems like a little bit of exaggeration, to put it mildly. And I was curious about Gardon writing still as a historian of Jewish experience and a novelist, as opposed to contributing of Crimea. I mean, like, what is this like? Because there's this whole narrative of Jewish heroism. Einigkeit is obsessed with that. You know, Pfeffer and what's his name? I forget. Is doing the Red Book. You know, Jews contributing to heroic effort. And I don't know, the whole Blavatnik initiative is all about that. You know, Jewish heroes contributing to the victory. So where is Gardon on Jews building Crimea? You know what I mean? Like that part of the story. So sorry for talking so long, but I mean, please go ahead and answer these questions, I guess, in the order that you spoke, and then if there are more, we'll add. Oh, David, we can't hear you. Turn on your mic.
Okay, Anya, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, but I'll do my best. You see, the Holocaust only comes up retrospectively. It's only as how the war experiences are obstacles to these people having fruitful relationships after the war. So we never get any kind of systematic narrative of the Vilna Ghetto here. It is how our pasts and the pasts of the people who are important in our lives, how that haunts us, and we can't escape it. So I would never say Grade wants to give us a history of the Vilna Ghetto. And I'll just add in, that's my answer to your question. But everyone has in their past things that really is an obstacle to moving forward in life. That is the basic theme of the novel. And of course, I'll just throw in the last idea that, of course, he's really reworking his own biography. I mean, he is, you know, separated from his wife. She perishes, he doesn't, and he takes, you know, 4 different couples, many of whom have exactly that experience, you know, separated, somebody perished, some didn't. He's trying to play out different versions of what happened or could have happened to himself.
And I thought, you know, like, I think he really picked up, based on what you're saying, on emotions that are circulating. And that is, we hear from survivors that women are always crying. There's always a crying behind closed doors, but there's that there. And I think he really articulated that, you know, that comes through for sure. So, yeah, thank you. Okay, Hannah, go ahead, please.
Well, I want to show you something right here. I have not one, but 2 copies of I know it appears backwards for you, of Vasily Grossman's, the Yiddish version of Trablitsky Ad, which is Treblinker Genem. And so first of all, if anyone wants one of these copies, you can write me and I'll send it to you. I don't think I actually need 2 copies of this rare book, but I just happen to have them. But it just happened to be on my desk. And I think it answers part of your question, which is that there was this zone of writing, of testimony, of exploring modes of testimony, of exploring ways to talk about what would later be called the Holocaust, that bounced or it moved dynamically between Russian and Yiddish, like this text. So Vasily Grossman spoke to people he spoke to survivors in Yiddish. He translated into Russian, wrote a book in Russian, which is translated into Yiddish and probably was more popular in Yiddish for a while. And there are parts that only appear in the Russian, don't appear in the Yiddish, and so forth. So there was a kind of dialogue, I think, between the languages. But what I want to say is that, and what I tried to say in the paper is that Grossman, but especially Ehrenburg, they wanted to convey these stories, but there was a kind of benevolence in the way that they conveyed the stories of survivors, because it wasn't just that they were survivors, these other people were survivors and we are, on the fighting side. There was also a type of cultural superiority, I think, between the Western old-fashioned Jews and the more enlightened, ideologically forward-looking Jews. And so they felt the need to translate, in the larger sense of the term, these simple testimonies into something grander and more important. And that's why I think that Sutzkever changed that, where he was actually both the grand one, the interpreter, and also the experiencer. And yes, I definitely think I have to look back at the date of Gurevich's letter, but he could have seen, think of how exciting it was to see the Hebraic, whatever, Jewish words, Kol Nidre, in Cyrillic characters in Pravda. Very exciting just to see that. So he could have written about that. He could have also just heard about the poem. There were rumors about the poem. It was in circulation. So there was a kind of aura around the poem that I think attracted people. So I hope I answered you. And really, the offers.
Hannah, as you were speaking and showing us the rarity, a question came for you, which I'm going to read real quickly, from Peter Moses, and it says, was there also criticism directed at Sutzkever for supposedly running away from the conflict while these soldiers were on the front line of the fight against fascism?
Thank you. We don't know, because Sutzkever was portrayed as a fighter. He was in a partisan unit. Granted, in that partisan unit, his role was as a historian, but nonetheless, he was portrayed as a fighter, which was why he was selected for this role. He wouldn't have been uplifted in the Soviet press had he not had a fighting profile as well. So,
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Misha, you go next.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So first, I think the motif of people who are between dead and alive is prominent in Yiddish folklore and in literature. You have Banacht auf Nalten Markt by Peretz is all about that. And there is a certain belief that people have to be buried properly, and it takes a while, and they're very eager to come back. And in the context of the Soviet kind of interpretation of the Holocaust, I had another story in this presentation by Noah Chaluria, which is called Vergessen und Gedenken. And this is basically, there's an officer who comes home and his wife finds a photograph of a woman, and she is obviously nervous about it. Turns out that he found this photograph in the shtetl, and that was the only remainder of that woman that is left, and he took it. And then they have a conversation where he says, we have to forget about it because we cannot live on, and yet we cannot forget about it. And that's the kind of the end of it. So they are, in that position. I think it's a very good imagery that Gloria has here. Mm-hmm.
True.
I also try to give a very compressed answer. The thing is that I believe that usually bad literature is more interesting for historian than good literature. A historian as a human being, of course, enjoys nice literature, but many more we can get out from a kind of a documentary story. A story, and in this sense, Shmuel Gardon is very interesting. Yes, he was not a great prose writer by any means. His novels, but his entire life, before the war and especially after the war, he has effectively documented Soviet Jewish life, and everyone who is interested in Soviet Jewish life can find very interesting takes and details in his writing. This was his objective. He was not bombastic, yes. So it was not heroic, not from time to time, yeah. But in general, he was this kind of a matter-of-fact literature, yeah, and therefore it is valuable.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this fascinating panel. Thank you to our audience. And I think it's my job to wrap us up. We have 26 seconds to go. So we're like Stehanovites here, but they're like great. Thank you so much. And we're moving on to the next session.
Thank you, Anna. We are just a few moments away from our next session. So thank you to this incredible panel. We're really quite pleased for your participation, and we look forward to what's next. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.